I like tropes in fantasy-oriented games. Whether it's goblins ambushing unsuspecting travelers on the road, kobolds praying to a holy light source and guarding it with a life, or skeletons, reanimated bones that slowly shamble towards their target, relentless and emotionless. Quite fitting that these range of miniatures are called the Shambling Bones. I got them via a Kickstarter campaign from Bequest Miniatures. These are metal-casted, handcrafted miniatures, so they have that perfect old school vibe that I really like. So this is not sponsored, just something I wanted to share with you. If you missed the campaign, you are not out of luck though, as Jonas of Bequest Miniatures assured me you get another chance at these further down the line. If you don't want to miss that, you can give him a follow on his Instagram or YouTube account. Right now, he runs another Kickstarter campaign for some very nice looking old school Space Marine miniatures. I've provided links to all these in the description below. Again, this is not sponsored, simply my own honest recommendation for miniatures that have that great handcrafted touch. Painting these was a blast, where I started from a simple brown priming, followed with green ink from below and a zenithal with a mix of teal and a warm off-white. I then simply highlighted the bones with a light green blue, followed by pure white in the most exposed areas. At that point, I wanted more shading for the bones, so I opted to go with apothecary white contrast paint. This stuff successfully gave the bones a more uniform finish, but did not tint the previously applied layer too much like a normal wash. The cloth parts were simply based with violet from Chimera paints. With Vallejo's Sunny Skin Tone, I mixed a few gradients, leading to the pure orangey tone of that color, and applied these as highlights. For the metallic parts, I went with Vallejo's Steel Metal color and mixed it with a few drops of the aforementioned green ink. I wanted just a hint of green in the metal, so 1 or 2 drops were enough. After that, I washed the metallic parts with a heavy watered down rust tone and applied silver highlights to the edges. For leather, wood and fur parts, I went with a base coat of Vallejo Skin Wash. I mixed Beastie Brown, Camouflage Green and Dead Slash in varying gradients, and applied these also as highlight colors. In the end, I added a very simple symbol to the standard, cleaned up a few mistakes, and added a few tufts to have my skeletons ready for shambling. Now, the only thing the skeletons needed was a fitting location where adventurers could be ambushed by them. Naturally, I thought about a cemetery. This video is in some way about tropes after all. And again, I felt inspired by a video game, this time Dark Souls. I still remember the first time I naively went the wrong way after arriving at Firelink Shrine, which, well, resulted in that infamous "you died" screen. Now, what I find so interesting in this location is its ramshackle appearance. I know graveyards as very orderly layouted and well looked after places, and definitely not in a chaotic state like that. So, with that idea in my head, I went directly to crafting. First, I cut out a base out of PVC foam board. This is a great material for terrain bases in my opinion, as it's sturdy but still cuttable with a simple crafting knife. No need for fancy cutting tools. Just be careful to not cut yourself. I opted to go with 1 big base, 2 medium-sized bases, and 2 which were, well, smaller than the others. In my head, this graveyard is permeated by countless small rock formations, which would add to the ramshackle look I was aiming for. So I decided to add rocky platforms on every base. Here I opted to go with cork bark. This stuff is easily found at local pet stores. You may however want to clean it up a bit before you start crafting with it. Now adding these to their bases is extremely fun and fulfilling, as you can go as random as you want. Whatever you get in the end can easily be rectified later. At this stage I also added a few styrofoam scraps to fill in the gaps between the bark pieces. All these areas will be later covered in plaster, so it really doesn't matter that much what you use for this. I'd recommend something light and cheap though. After gluing these pieces in place, I started to add the first bigger scenery pieces, like old dried wood branches to act as dead trees, and these 3D printed wall pieces. These are from the Hagelthorn Hollow Printable Terrain set, available at Printable Scenery. You'll find the link down below. I also sealed the cork bark with watered down PVA. This catches the rest of the dirt and protects the bark from potential damage. With all that in place, I mixed myself a small batch of sculptor mold. This stuff is not so easy to come by here in Germany. It's also a little bit expensive. But most of you are from the US, and I figured I should at least try it out. I mix it in a ratio of 2 parts sculptor mold and 1 part water, just like the instructions suggest. I also added a bit of brown and black paint to get a grey base tone for the plaster. This way you won't have white spots if you scratch the surface by accident. Sculptor mold is pretty easy to handle and non-toxic. My gloves here were just for convenience, as applying this is still pretty messy. The sculptor mold took a while to dry, so I used my downtime to get the tombstones ready. These are resin cast, that means a bit of preparation is in order. Resin cast miniatures do have sometimes a bit of mold release left on their surface. This needs to be washed off first, as this stuff not only prevents the cast from sticking to the mold, but also prevents the paint from sticking to the cast. But this is easily rectified with an old toothbrush and a bit of soapy water. After this cleaning step, I drilled holes into the undersides of the gravestones and pinned them. The contact area between gravestone and the piece of terrain is already pretty small, and by adding this small piece of wire, the bond is at least a bit more secure. With the plaster fully cured, I added my tombstones. Here I deliberately chose to add them in groups of uneven numbers. Why, you might ask? Well, it's pretty simple. Somehow our brain tends to treat even numbers as very orderly or artificial. Whether it's random bricks, skulls or other terrain clutter, if you arrange them in uneven numbered groups, you'll always get a slightly more organic look. And that's exactly what I was aiming for. I also added a few other scenery bits like this statue and this fountain from Arkan Studios' Dungeons & Lasers line. Both those bits and the wall pieces were then covered by a groundwater PVA and paint mix to A. give them more texture, and B. to fill in the layer lines of the 3D printed wall segments. To add a bit more realism to the trees, I wanted to add roots that burst out of the earth, which, in my mind at least, would add to the overgrown look I was aiming for. To accomplish that, I took some small wood sticks and glued them, again, in uneven numbered groups in close proximity to the tree trunks. The ends of the roots were simply covered with more of the grout mix, so they would blend nicely with the ground. While waiting for these parts to dry, I started digging in my bits box. I wanted to use this opportunity to add a few more small story elements to spark the imagination of those playing in this location. I think these little things can elevate your build to something that feels unique and truly your own, and are, in my opinion, so much more important than crafting something to the most realistic standard, especially when you're crafting for the tabletop. In the end, I finished the building step with applying texture paste to the rim of the bases. Now with all the bits and bobs in place, I started to paint the pieces. Here I first primed the whole set in Molotov's hazelnut brown. Slowly but surely, it's becoming my go-to primer for most paint jobs. I also applied sap green ink to the areas where I imagined grass patches. The tombstones were then painted with Molotov's Lagoon Blue, which is a nice vibrant teal color. I also gave the walls, the statue and the fountain the same base color. My plan was to give these pieces a bit of a ghostly vibe, and I thought that teal would be a first good base to build upon. At this point I also went a few times back and forth to correct a bit of overspray and other unwanted colors. When I was happy with that, I first shaded the rocks with heavily diluted mixes of indigo blue and ochre yellow. For the tombstones I used Terradon turquoise contrast paint, which I mixed with almost the same amount of water to dull down the tint of the color. I also added this to the walls and the other scenery pieces to tie them all together. After letting all these dry, I dry brushed the rocks with neutral grey, followed by pebble grey for the highlights of all pieces. This didn't turn out so great on the turquoise painted pieces. So I reapplied the contrast paint again and chose another approach for these parts. Luckily, I still had the paints I used for the skeletons on my wet palette, so I decided to use some of these same tones. This had the added benefit of tying both miniatures and terrain together, and I also reused paints that otherwise would land in the trash. I highlighted the tombstones with a mixture of Vallejo's Nocturna shadow and light green blue with pure light green blue for the most exposed parts and corners. I used the same procedure on the walls where I've previously painted every rock with pure Nocturna shadow. I also painted the rest of the bits in color schemes similar to my painted Shambling bones. At that point I was close to the finish line as I took out my pre-mixed basing sand. This is basically bird sand with a bit of tile grout mixed with appropriate colored pigments. In this case I used a mixture of brown and green pigments to get the right earth tone. I also had other batches of pre-mixed coarse and medium grit sand with a slightly different coloration. I added PVA to the areas I wanted and added first coarse grit, then medium grit, and after that the bird sand mix, which I mixed with fine flock to add even more visual variety. This fine flock was also added to selected areas on the statue, the walls, the fountain and the trees to simulate a bit of mossy overgrowth. After I was done with that step, I doused the pieces in isopropyl alcohol and added watered down PVA via a pipette to really seal in the sand on the flock. As a last finishing touch, I really wanted to enforce this overgrown look. And I also wanted to try out this relatively cheap static grass applicator that I found on Amazon. Luckily, I already owned this assortment of varying static grass products from Nock and World War Scenics. So I simply took a bit of every product and loaded that into the applicator, covered the designated areas with PVA and applied first flower tufts followed by the static grass. The great thing about these applicators is that they apply a static charge to the grass, which in turn makes your grass stand up, hence the name static grass. Without an applicator like this, you get a very flat application which looks pretty bad in my opinion. Now, after letting all that dry and fixing up some minor mistakes, this cemetery was ready for exploration. And here are the Shambling bones, shambling across their new cozy homes. This was a very fulfilling and interesting project where I certainly learned a few new tricks. I hope you did too, or at least feel inspired to make something of your own. I'm particularly proud of these little story bits I managed to incorporate, like this warrior who was decapitated by an axe that still separates the body from the head, or the shield and sword that somehow nobody dared to touch while lying for years and years on their owner's grave. I wonder why. Well, what do you think? Let me know in the comments, and if you like this video, please consider leaving a like to let me know you want more of these types of videos. If you do, you are more than welcome to subscribe to the channel. We are still closing in on the 10,000 subscriber count, which I am still incredibly thankful for. I'll try to push out a video every other week, but I'm still doing this in my free time, and these videos take a lot of work and sometimes normal life gets a bit in the way. But I can tell you that you can expect some exciting announcement in the near future, which I can't wait to share with you. So until then, why not check out another build I made a while back? I'm really looking forward to the next one and wish you, for now at least, farewell, fellow adventurers.